Open any family photo album from 1975 and find the wedding pictures, and you will notice something almost immediately. The dress is simpler than you expect. The guest list is smaller than you expect. And somewhere in that stack of photographs, there is very likely a reception held in a church basement or a backyard, with a cake that came from a local bakery rather than a specialty vendor, and a band made up of someone's uncle and his friends rather than a hired professional. American weddings 50 years ago were not smaller because people cared less. They were smaller because an entire industry that now surrounds modern weddings simply did not exist yet in anything like its current form. No wedding planners advertising in glossy magazines. No destination ceremonies flown in from across the country. No elaborate registry culture built around gift cards and online wish lists. Weddings were, for the most part, community events, built by families, neighbors, and church congregations working together, and they looked, sounded, and cost dramatically different from what a modern American wedding looks like today. So what did an actual American wedding look like in the middle of the 1970s? Who paid for it, who attended it, and what happened at the reception afterward? And which single tradition from this era has all but vanished today, even though at the time it was considered simply obvious and expected? We are counting down 15 things that defined what American weddings looked like 50 years ago. One honest word before we start. Weddings in any era vary enormously by region, religion, and family income. A wedding in a small Midwestern farming town in 1975 looked genuinely different from one in a wealthy East Coast suburb the same year. So take this list as the broad common picture drawn from what was standard and widely practiced at the time, not a claim that every single wedding followed an identical script. What is certain is that every tradition on this list was common enough, and different enough from today, that anyone who attended or was part of a wedding during this era will recognize it instantly. Number 15. The bride's family paid for almost everything. 50 years ago, the financial expectation around a wedding was clear and rarely questioned. The bride's family covered the overwhelming majority of the costs: the dress, the flowers, the reception venue, the catering, and often the invitations themselves, while the groom's family was expected to cover a much smaller, specific set of costs, typically the rehearsal dinner and the honeymoon. This division of financial responsibility traced back to older dowry traditions and was treated as simply how things were done, rarely negotiated or discussed openly between families. A father walking his daughter down the aisle in this era had very often spent months, sometimes years, setting aside money specifically for this one event, and the total cost of an average American wedding remained a small fraction of what a modern wedding costs, even when adjusted for inflation. Number 14. The wedding announcement in the local newspaper. Before social media existed to spread the news of an engagement or a wedding, the local newspaper served as the primary way an entire community learned that a couple had married, and nearly every American town of any size ran a dedicated section for wedding announcements, complete with a formal photograph of the bride, a description of her dress, and a list of the wedding party. These announcements followed a genuinely rigid format. The bride's parents were named first and prominently. Her education and occupation were briefly mentioned, and the groom's information appeared in a shorter paragraph beneath hers. Clipping this announcement out of the newspaper and saving it in a scrapbook was such a common practice that many families today still have these yellowed newspaper clippings tucked into old photo albums, the only surviving record of a wedding beyond the photographs themselves. Number 13. Homemade or church basement receptions. A genuinely enormous number of American wedding receptions 50 years ago were not held at hotels or dedicated event venues at all, but in church basements, community halls, or a family member's own backyard, decorated by hand using crepe paper streamers, folding tables borrowed from the church, and flowers cut from a relative's garden rather than ordered from a florist. This was not viewed as a budget compromise the way it might be seen today. It was simply the standard, expected setting for a wedding reception in most American communities, and the people attending understood and appreciated the genuine effort that went into decorating a familiar, ordinary space into something special for the day. Aunts, cousins, and neighbors often spent the entire day before the wedding setting up tables and chairs together, turning the reception itself into a genuine community effort rather than something outsourced entirely to paid vendors. Number 12. The receiving line as a mandatory ritual. Every guest at a wedding 50 years ago expected to pass through a formal receiving line, typically positioned just outside the ceremony space or at the entrance to the reception, where the bride, the groom, and both sets of parents stood in a fixed order to personally greet every single person who had come to celebrate with them. This was not optional or casual. Skipping the receiving line was considered a genuine breach of wedding etiquette, and etiquette guides of the era spent considerable space explaining the exact order guests were expected to stand in, and what each greeting should sound like. For a wedding with several hundred guests, this line could genuinely take an hour or more to work through, with the wedding party standing the entire time, smiling and shaking hands with people some of them had never met before that exact moment. Number 11. A specific, formal seating chart for the reception dinner. Unlike the more relaxed, mingling style common at many modern receptions, weddings 50 years ago typically followed a genuinely formal seating arrangement for the reception meal, with the wedding party seated at a distinct head table facing the rest of the guests, and family members and close friends assigned to specific tables based on a careful, often genuinely stressful planning process undertaken by the mothers of the bride and groom in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Getting this seating chart wrong, seating estranged relatives too close together, or failing to properly separate certain family members, was considered a genuine social misstep that could cause real tension at the reception itself, and many mothers spent hours at the kitchen table with handwritten place cards trying to solve what amounted to a genuinely complicated social puzzle. Number 10. The garter toss and bouquet toss as genuine highlights. Both of these traditions existed well before this era, but 50 years ago they occupied a much more central, expected place in the reception program than they do at many modern weddings, treated as genuine highlight moments that the entire reception paused to watch. The garter toss in particular carried a specific ritual sequence, the groom retrieving the garter from the bride's leg in front of the assembled guests, followed by the toss itself to a crowd of unmarried male guests, a moment considered good-natured fun at the time that many modern couples have quietly dropped from their own receptions as attitudes toward the tradition shifted. The bouquet toss followed a nearly identical format aimed at unmarried female guests, and both traditions carried genuine superstitious weight, with the catcher supposedly destined to marry next. Number 9. Wedding gifts displayed openly at the reception. Rather than the modern registry system built around online wish lists, wedding gifts 50 years ago were typically brought physically to the reception itself, wrapped and displayed on a dedicated table for all the guests to see throughout the evening, and often opened publicly by the bride at some point during the celebration, while guests watched and commented. This created a genuinely different social dynamic around gift giving. Guests could see exactly what others had brought, and the bride's reaction to each gift became part of the shared entertainment of the reception itself. Common gifts of the era reflected genuinely practical household needs, sets of dishware, table linens, kitchen appliances, items meant to help a young couple furnish an entire household from scratch, since it was far more common at the time for a newly married couple to be setting up their very first home together rather than combining two already established households. Number 8. The traditional white wedding cake with specific tiered symbolism. The wedding cake 50 years ago followed a much more standardized format than the wildly varied custom cakes common today, typically a white or cream-colored cake with several tiers, decorated with simple piped frosting details rather than the elaborate fondant sculptures that became popular decades later. The cutting of the cake followed a genuinely fixed ritual sequence, the bride and groom cutting the first slice together with their hands overlapping on a single knife, followed by feeding each other a small bite in front of the assembled guests, a moment considered essential enough that professional and amateur photographers alike made sure to capture it. Saving the top tier of the cake to be frozen and eaten on the couple's first wedding anniversary was also a widely practiced tradition of this era, one that has become considerably less common today. Number 7. Formal thank you notes handwritten for every single gift. Etiquette expectations around thank you notes 50 years ago were considerably stricter than today, and a new bride was expected to handwrite a genuinely personal, individual thank you note for every single gift received, typically within a specific window of weeks after the wedding, mentioning the gift itself by name and expressing specific gratitude rather than sending a generic printed card. For a wedding with 100 or more gifts, this represented a genuinely significant undertaking, and many brides of this era spent weeks working through a stack of stationery specifically purchased for this purpose. Failing to send a proper handwritten thank you note within a reasonable time was considered a genuine social failure, one that female relatives in particular felt entitled to comment on if it did not happen promptly enough. Number 6. The groom rented his tuxedo, and often his own father did not own a suit for the occasion. Formal wedding attire for men 50 years ago typically meant a rented tuxedo from a local formal wear shop rather than a purchased suit, and this rental culture extended to the entire male wedding party, groomsmen, fathers, and often even guests attending a particularly formal wedding. Local tuxedo rental shops did a significant portion of their annual business specifically around the wedding season, measuring and fitting an entire wedding party in the weeks leading up to the ceremony. This rental-based approach to formal menswear reflected a broader reality of the era. Formal occasions requiring this level of dress were genuinely rare enough in an average man's life that owning a tuxedo outright made little practical sense compared to simply renting one each time the need arose. Number 5. Weddings almost always took place in the couple's hometown, not a destination. The concept of a destination wedding, traveling to a resort location or an exotic setting specifically for the ceremony itself, was almost entirely absent from mainstream American wedding culture 50 years ago, and the overwhelming majority of weddings took place in the bride's home church or a venue within her own community, with guests expected to travel to her, rather than the couple traveling somewhere else and asking guests to follow. This reflected both practical financial reality. Air travel remained genuinely expensive relative to average income, and a cultural expectation that a wedding was fundamentally a community event belonging to the town and congregation the bride had grown up in, rather than a private experience the couple curated somewhere else entirely. Number 4. The honeymoon was frequently a road trip, not a flight. Reflecting the same financial and cultural reality, honeymoons 50 years ago were far more commonly a car trip to a domestic destination. A national park, a lakeside cabin, a coastal town within driving distance, rather than an international flight to a resort. Niagara Falls in particular held an almost legendary status as a honeymoon destination throughout this era, so thoroughly associated with newly married couples that the association itself became a genuine cultural joke referenced constantly in television and film of the period. Couples decorating the getaway car with tin cans tied to the bumper and handwritten signs reading "Just Married" was a widely practiced send-off tradition, one that many older Americans specifically remember as part of their own wedding day. Number 3. The father-daughter and mother-son dances followed a strict, expected format. While dancing at the reception generally was less elaborate than the choreographed routines common at some modern weddings, certain specific dances 50 years ago were treated as genuinely mandatory rather than optional, particularly the father-daughter dance and the corresponding mother-son dance, each following a simple, traditional slow dance format rather than any kind of rehearsed performance. These moments were considered essential enough to the structure of the reception that skipping them entirely would have been noticed and commented on by guests, and they typically occurred at a specific, predictable point in the evening's timeline that every experienced wedding band or hired musician understood without needing instruction. Number 2. A live local band or a single hired organist, never a professional DJ. The now standard practice of hiring a professional wedding DJ with a full sound system and a curated evening of music simply did not exist yet in this era, and receptions were instead provided music by a local live band, often made up of family friends or semi-professional musicians who played weddings as a regular side income, or in more modest arrangements. Simply a record player managed by a family member switching albums throughout the evening. Church ceremonies themselves were almost universally accompanied by a live organist rather than any recorded music, and selecting the specific hymns and processional music was treated as a genuinely important decision made carefully in consultation with the church's own music director in the weeks before the ceremony. Number 1. The reception ended early, and the couple left before most guests did. Perhaps the most distinctly different aspect of a wedding 50 years ago compared to today was simply its length and its ending. Receptions typically wrapped up by early evening, often by 8 or 9 o'clock at the latest, with the bride and groom formally departing partway through the celebration amid a send-off of thrown rice and shouted well wishes, while guests remained behind to continue socializing without them for a while longer. This reflected a genuinely different expectation about what a wedding day was actually for, a formal, relatively brief community celebration rather than an all-night event, and the couple's early departure for their honeymoon was treated as the natural, expected climax of the day rather than something unusual or rushed. 15 traditions, 15 small pieces of a wedding day that once belonged almost entirely to family, church, and community rather than a hired industry of vendors and planners. None of these traditions disappeared because they stopped matching to the people who practiced them. They faded because the culture around marriage itself changed, incomes changed, travel became easier and cheaper, and an entire commercial wedding industry grew up to offer options that simply did not exist when your grandparents stood at the altar. The couples who lived through these weddings did not know they were part of a specific, soon-to-change era. They just knew it was their wedding day, built the way every wedding around them had always been built. If your parents or grandparents were married during this era, tell us in the comments what their wedding actually looked like, and which of these traditions you remember hearing about or seeing in their own photographs. And if there is a tradition from this time we missed here, one your own family still talks about that never made this list, tell us what it was and how it played out on their wedding day.